In Maine, electrical installations must comply with the National Electrical Code, referred to as NEC, and the State of Maine electrical laws and rules. The NEC requires a service disconnect, also known as the main disconnect, to be installed at the point of entry of the electrical service into building. It must be readily accessible from outside the building, as detailed in NEC 230.70. The NEC allows for a disconnect to be installed remotely from the electrical panel, provided certain conditions are met. The maximum distance between the disconnect and the panel is determined by the type of electrical distribution system used. For a single-phase service, if it's an underground service, the maximum distance is 50 feet. If it's an overhead service, the maximum distance is 100 feet. For a three-phase service, if it's an underground service, the maximum distance is 75 feet. If it's an overhead service, the maximum distance is 150 feet. There are conditions that need to be met for remote disconnects. Firstly, the disconnect must be clearly labeled and visible from the exterior of the building. Secondly, the disconnect must be readily accessible for maintenance and operation. Thirdly, the conductors between the disconnect and the panel must be protected from physical damage. There is an exception for metered disconnects. In certain cases, the service disconnect can be installed at the meter instead of at the point of entry. This is allowed if the meter is located on the exterior of the building and is accessible to the utility company. In this case, the maximum distance between the meter and the panel is 100 feet for a single-phase service and 150 feet for a three-phase service. Based on this information, it is generally permissible in Maine to install the breaker box in a separate location from the service disconnect, as long as the disconnect is installed in accordance with the NEC and State of Maine regulations. The maximum distance between the disconnect and the panel will depend on the type of electrical distribution system used and other factors specified in the NEC. It is recommended to consult with a qualified electrician for specific guidance and to ensure compliance with all applicable codes and regulations. When considering electrical installations and the placement of a breaker box relative to the service disconnect in Maine, it's crucial to understand the applicable electrical codes and regulations. The National Electrical Code, NEC, serves as the foundation, supplemented by specific State of Maine electrical laws and rules. The primary requirement is that a service disconnect, often called the main disconnect, must be installed where the electrical service enters the building. This disconnect must be easily accessible from outside the structure, a requirement outlined in NEC section 230.70a. While the NEC permits locating the disconnect remotely from the electrical panel, certain conditions must be satisfied. The allowable distance between the disconnect and the panel hinges on the electrical distribution system in use. For a single-phase service, if the service is underground, the maximum permissible distance is 50 feet. Conversely, for an overhead service, the maximum distance extends to 100 feet. When dealing with a three-phase service, the distances differ. An underground service allows for a maximum distance of 75 feet, while an overhead service permits a maximum distance of 150 feet. These distances are in place to ensure safety and accessibility in case of emergencies or maintenance. In addition to distance limitations, several other conditions must be met when implementing a remote disconnect. The disconnect must be clearly labeled and easily visible from the building's exterior, facilitating quick identification and access. Furthermore, the disconnect must be readily accessible for both routine maintenance and operational needs. This ensures that qualified personnel can perform necessary tasks without obstruction. The conductors connecting the disconnect and the panel must be adequately protected from physical damage. This protection can take various forms, such as encasing the conductors in conduit or using other appropriate protective measures to prevent damage from impact, abrasion, or other environmental factors. There's an exception that pertains to metered disconnects. In some instances, the service disconnect can be installed at the meter rather than at the point of entry to the building. However, this is only permissible if the meter is situated in the exterior of the building and is accessible to the utility company. When this condition is met, the maximum distance between the meter and the panel is 100 feet for a single-phase service and 150 feet for a three-phase service. This exception acknowledges the practicalities of certain installation scenarios while maintaining safety standards. In conclusion, Maine's electrical codes generally allow for installing the breaker box in a location separate from the service disconnect, provided that the disconnect is installed in accordance with both the NEC and the state of Maine regulations. Specific maximum distance between the disconnect and the panel will depend on the type of electrical distribution system utilized and any other relevant factors outlined in the NEC. Given the complexities of electrical installations and the importance of adhering to safety standards, it is highly recommended to consult with a qualified electrician for project-specific guidance. A qualified electrician can assess the unique characteristics of the installation, ensure compliance with all applicable codes and regulations, and provide expert advice to optimize safety and performance. When planning electrical work, it is important to consider various factors that influence safety, functionality, and compliance with electrical codes. In Maine, as in other jurisdictions, adherence to the National Electrical Code (NEC) is essential. Additionally, state and local regulations may impose further requirements. Before commencing any electrical work, it is prudent to consult with local authorities or a qualified electrical inspector to ensure full compliance with all applicable rules and regulations. The service disconnect, also known as the main disconnect, is a critical component of an electrical system. Its primary function is to provide a means of disconnecting the entire electrical supply to a building or structure in the event of an emergency or during maintenance activities. The NEC mandates that the service disconnect be readily accessible from outside the building. This requirement is intended to enable emergency responders, such as firefighters, to quickly de-energize the electrical system in hazardous situations. While the NEC permits the installation of a remote disconnect, there are strict guidelines governing its implementation. The maximum permissible distance between the disconnect and the electrical panel depends on several factors, including the type of electrical service, whether the service is underground or overhead, and any specific requirements imposed by local codes. For single-phase services, which are commonly found in residential applications, the maximum distance between the disconnect and the panel is generally limited to 50 feet for underground services and 100 feet for overhead services. However, these distances may vary depending on local interpretations of the NEC and any additional requirements imposed by the local jurisdiction. Three-phase services, which are often used in commercial and industrial settings, typically allow for greater distances between the disconnect and the panel. In such cases, the maximum distance is generally limited to 75 feet for underground services and 150 feet for overhead services. As with single-phase services, these distances may be subject to local variations and additional requirements. Regardless of the type of electrical service or the allowable distance, several conditions must be met when installing a remote disconnect. The disconnect must be clearly labeled and readily visible from the exterior of the building. This ensures that anyone needing to access the disconnect can easily locate it even in low light conditions or during an emergency. The disconnect must also be readily accessible for maintenance and operation. This means that it must be located in a position that allows qualified personnel to safely and easily access the disconnect for inspection, testing, and repairs. The conductors connecting the disconnect and the panel must be adequately protected from physical damage. This can be achieved by encasing the conductors in conduit, using shielded cables, or implementing other protective measures that prevent damage from impact, abrasion, or environmental factors. In certain cases, the service disconnect may be installed at the meter instead of at the point of entry to the building. This arrangement is typically permitted only if the meter is located on the exterior of the building and is accessible to the utility company. When the disconnect is installed at the meter, the maximum distance between the meter and the panel is usually limited to 100 feet for single-phase services and 150 feet for three-phase services. However, local codes may impose stricter requirements. Given the complexity of electrical codes and the potential for variations in local interpretations, it is strongly recommended to consult with a qualified electrician before commencing any electrical work. A qualified electrician can provide expert guidance on code compliance, safety best practices, and the proper installation of electrical equipment. It's important to remember that electrical codes are constantly evolving, and it is the responsibility of every electrician to stay up to date on the latest requirements. Consulting with a qualified electrician can help ensure that your electrical work is safe, compliant, and performed to the highest standards. Understanding the electrical codes and regulations specific to Maine is essential when planning the electrical layout of a new home or any other electrical project. While the National Electrical Code (NEC) provides a baseline for electrical safety, Maine's electrical laws and rules may have additional requirements or interpretations that must be followed. The service disconnect, also known as the main disconnect, plays a crucial role in ensuring electrical safety. It allows for the complete shut-off of electrical power to a building or structure, which is essential during emergencies or maintenance activities. The NEC mandates that the service disconnect be readily accessible from outside the building, allowing emergency responders and qualified personnel to quickly de-energize the electrical system when necessary. If you intend to install the breaker box in a location separate from the service disconnect, it's important to understand the limitations and requirements regarding the distance between the two. The NEC allows for remote disconnects, but the maximum distance is determined by the type of electrical service and other factors. For single-phase services, which are common in residential buildings, the maximum distance between the disconnect and the panel typically ranges from 50 feet to 100 feet, depending on whether the service is underground or overhead. For three-phase services, which are often used in commercial and industrial buildings, the maximum distance may be greater, typically ranging from 75 feet to 150 feet. However, it's important to verify these distances with the local authorities or a qualified electrician, as they may be subject to local interpretations or amendments to the NEC. In addition to the distance limitations, there are other important conditions that must be met when installing a remote disconnect. Firstly, the disconnect must be clearly labeled and visible from the exterior of the building, ensuring that it can be easily located in an emergency. Secondly, the disconnect must be readily accessible for maintenance and operation, allowing qualified personnel to safely and easily inspect and service the disconnect. Thirdly, the conductors connecting the disconnect and the panel must be adequately protected from physical damage, preventing potential hazards such as electrical shorts or fires. In some cases, the service disconnect may be installed at the meter instead of at the point of entry to the building. This arrangement is typically allowed if the meter is located on the exterior of the building and is accessible to the utility company. When the disconnect is installed at the meter, the maximum distance between the meter and the panel may be different from the standard requirements for remote disconnect. Given the complexities of electrical codes and regulations, it's always recommended to consult with a qualified electrician for specific guidance on your electrical project. A qualified electrician can assess your specific situation, provide expert advice on code compliance, and ensure that your electrical installation is safe and reliable. They can also help you navigate any local interpretations or amendments to the NEC and ensure that your project meets all applicable requirements. Remember that electrical work can be dangerous if not performed correctly, so it's always best to leave it to the professionals. Consulting with a qualified electrician can help you avoid costly mistakes and ensure that your electrical system is installed safely and efficiently. Electrical codes and regulations are in place to protect people and property from electrical hazards. By following these codes and regulations, you can help ensure that your electrical system is safe, reliable, and compliant with all applicable requirements. The information provided here is intended for general guidance only and should not be considered a substitute for professional advice from a qualified electrician. Always consult with a qualified electrician before commencing any electrical work.